Welcome to Triptych Horror. 3 started. Only 1 will be allowed to remain. 2 will be unmade, as cleanly as if they had never been written. 3 started. Only 1 will be allowed to remain. 2 will be unmade, as cleanly as if they had never been written. This is Triptych Horror. The Witness, by Morgan Olson. Triptych Horror, Season 0, Episode 8. An account of Lilly. Recovered from the deep archive, provenance disputed, filed under, commencement, 6th attempt, see also, Lilly, keys, old computer, general's protocol, low amperage signal. Note: this document has been reviewed for interference patterns. None were found. This is either reassuring or the most alarming thing in the archive. The reviewing archivist declined to specify which. 1. The archive that disagrees. The first thing they teach you when you come to the witnesses is how to read a clean record, not how to find information. Any system can find information. The teaching is finer than that. It is the cultivation of an instinct for the difference between a record that has degraded naturally, the way all records degrade, entropy working at the edges, and a record that has been touched, interfered with, a record that is missing something in the specific shape of a removal rather than the general shape of decay. Natural degradation is random. It takes the edges first, the periphery, the least reinforced connections. It looks like forgetting, which is what it is. Interference has a shape. It takes specific things. It leaves the edges intact and removes the center, or it removes a particular kind of content while leaving everything adjacent, or it creates a smoothness where roughness should be, a continuity where there should be a seam. It looks like nothing happened, which is how you know something did. Lilly had been reading records for longer than most civilizations had been keeping them, and she could feel interference the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue, not by finding it directly, but by finding the shape of its absence. The archive was full of absences, not the ordinary absences. Those she had catalogued and cross-referenced and accepted as the cost of maintaining a record across 40,000 years in a universe that was not always cooperative. The ordinary absences were large and obvious, and mostly concerned with civilizations that had stopped being, traditions that had faded, peoples whose names existed only in the witnesses' files, because the witnesses were the only ones who had been paying attention when those peoples were alive. These absences were different. They were small and precise and distributed across the archive in a pattern that Lilly had spent 300 years mapping before she understood what the pattern meant, and another 200 years sitting with what the pattern meant before she was ready to act on it. 500 years. The acolytes thought she was the archive. They were not wrong exactly. She had been in the deep levels long enough that the younger ones, the ones who had come up in the last century, had never seen her outside of it. She ate in the archive. She slept in the archive, in the small room off the 7th level that had been hers since the previous occupant pleasanted herself, and Lilly claimed it before anyone could suggest she take something larger and more appropriate to her seniority. She didn't want larger. She wanted close to the files. She wanted to be where the absences were. The acolytes brought her food and reports, and occasionally, when they thought she wouldn't notice, worried looks. She noticed. She didn't address it because the worry was correct, and addressing it would have required explaining what she was working on, and explaining what she was working on would have required bringing it to the council, and bringing it to the council would have produced exactly what councils produced, which was deliberation and precedent, and the weight of 5 previous false commencements pressing down on every conclusion, until the conclusions became tentative, and the tentative became indefinite, and the indefinite became another 500 years of watching the record disappear. She had read all 5 false commencement files. She knew what each of those women had seen. She knew the pattern they had identified, the evidence they had assembled, the certainty they had felt. She knew what had happened after. The protocol started, the signal sent, the wanderer who turned out not to be the wanderer, the generals who turned out not to be assembling, the keys reset, the sacred objects restored to their places, the woman who had turned them, living out the rest of her years with the settled weight of institutional doubt pressing on every thought she had afterward. 5 times, 5 women who had seen enough to act and been wrong about the timing. Lilly understood something about those 5 women that the official record did not contain. The official record described their commencements as errors, premature, insufficiently evidenced, the product of pattern recognition in the absence of sufficient data, the very human tendency to find signal in noise when the noise was scary enough. What the official record did not contain was the possibility that those 5 women had been right about the pattern and wrong only about the timing, that the nothing had been eating the record specifically to produce exactly this institutional hesitancy, this 5 commencement weight of being wrong pressing down on every subsequent woman who stood in the sacred room and felt the oath burning and had to decide whether this time was different. The nothing was patient. The nothing had been doing this for longer than the witnesses had been watching. And the most efficient way to prevent the witnesses from acting on what they saw was not to prevent them from seeing it. It was to let them see it, let them act, and then let them be wrong just enough times that the institution built a culture of doubt around the sacred room and the keys and the oath. 5 false commencements, not because those women were wrong about the pattern, but because the nothing had engineered the timing of their certainty. She had held this theory for most of those 5 centuries. She had not written it down. Writing it down would have put it in the archive, and the archive was compromised, and she was not going to put the one thing she was certain of into a record the nothing could eat. She held it in her head instead, the way the founding 9 had held the original oath before they had an archive to put it in. 9 women, no institution, just the knowledge and the fury and the willingness to act on it. She was working her way back to that. 2. The acolytes. The morning before Lilly turned the keys, 3 of the acolytes came to her with a case. They were young. The oldest was perhaps 60, barely past the first threshold of witness training, still in the stage where the sacred objects and the sacred timing and the sacred process felt like the point rather than the container for the point. They had the particular brightness of people who have been given access to a very large archive and have not yet understood that the archive is not the thing being protected. The thing being protected is what the archive points at. The archive is just the finger. Their names were Sene, Dovar, and the one Lilly privately thought of as the careful one, whose actual name she knew perfectly well and sometimes used for the specific reason that not using it helped her remember that the careful one's carefulness was a virtue and not just an obstacle. Her name was Marsh. They spread their findings on the table in the low light of the 7th level, and Lilly looked at what they had brought her and felt something move in her chest that was in the neighborhood of tenderness. They had found one of the absences, one of the small, precise removals she had been mapping for 3 centuries. They had found it the way young archivists find things, which is by looking at what's there rather than what isn't. And they had arrived at the edge of the absence and recognized it as significant without being able to say why. "The record breaks here," Senna said, pointing. She was the most technically precise of the 3, the one who read documents the way surgeons read bodies. So, looking for the thing that shouldn't be there, the anomaly that meant something. Not degrades, breaks. There's a clean edge on the gap that you don't get from entropy. "We thought it might be a formatting error," Dovar said. He was the most cautious of the 3, which in a witness acolyte was saying something. But Marsh found 11 more like it in adjacent files. Marsh, the careful one, laid out the 11 adjacent files without comment. She had cross-referenced them already. She had identified the shape of the pattern. She had, Lilly noted, been careful enough to map what the missing content might have been based on what remained at the edges, the way a paleontologist reconstructs a skeleton from the impression in rock. What she had reconstructed was a shape Lilly recognized, the outline of the loop, the shape of the thing the nothing had been eating. They had found it from the inside, working with contemporary records, without access to the impossible source date file that Lilly kept in a partition of the archive she had classified in a way that made it invisible to standard searches. They had found it because they were good archivists doing good work, because the witnesses trained good archivists, because 40,000 years of institutional practice produced people who could feel the difference between entropy and interference. They were exactly right about what they had found, and they were going to take it to the council. Lilly could see it in their faces. The brightness of discovery. The appropriate next step in the institutional process. We bring significant findings to the council. The council deliberates. The council weighs. The council makes a determination. Marsh was already composing the summary in her head, being careful, being thorough, being the kind of archivist the witnesses had spent 40,000 years learning to produce. "Good work," Lilly said. "Leave the files. I'll review them." Marsh looked at her with the expression of someone who has understood a thing ahead of schedule. "You've already seen this," Marsh said. Not accusatory, observational, the careful one, being careful. "I've seen the shape of it," Lilly said. "You've found a new corner. That's useful. Should we file a preliminary report?" "Leave the files," Lilly said. "Go eat something. Come back tomorrow." They went. Marsh looked back once from the corridor in a way that Lilly filed under "Remember this, she's going to be the one who has to carry it after." Lilly sat with the files they had brought her and the files she had been building for 3 centuries and the impossible source date file she kept partitioned from everything else, and she put them together in the order they went in, the order that told the story, the order the nothing had been specifically trying to prevent anyone from assembling. She read the whole thing straight through for the first time. It took 6 hours. When she was done, she sat for a while in the low light of the 7th level and felt the oath, which she had carried since she was young enough to be one of the bright ones herself, moving in her like a tide. 9 women, no institution, just the knowledge and the fury and the willingness. She stood up. 3. The sacred room. The sacred room was 3 levels below the archive's deepest operational level, in the part of the structure that predated the current building and possibly predated the witnesses as an institution. The founding documents were ambiguous about whether the room had been built for the keys, or the keys had been built for the room. Lilly had stopped caring about that question sometime in her 3rd century. Her first act on entering was to lock the lower levels, the one override that seniority provided without council authorization. She had chosen the deep watch hour deliberately, when the upper levels were minimally staffed and Marsh and Senna and Dover would be in their quarters. The lock would hold long enough. The keys were sacred jewelry in the sense that they were beautiful objects that had been treated with great ceremony for a very long time. They were also, in the mechanical sense, keys, physical objects that interfaced with the old system in the room and produced a specific outcome when turned in a specific sequence. The sacredness was accumulated. The function was original. Lilly had been in the room before. Every senior witness came here eventually for the investiture ceremony, the moment when the institution formally acknowledged that you had access to the highest levels of the archive and the weight of what that access meant. You stood in the room. You were shown the keys. You were told the history of the 6 commencements, 5 false, 1 pending, the pending one being the one that would be real, the one the oath was for, the one that would finally be the correct time. You were told about the old computer. You were told that the old computer would confirm when the correct time had arrived, that it had been waiting longer than the institution itself, that its confirmation was one of the conditions that the founding 9 had built into the protocol. Because the founding 9 had understood that human pattern recognition, however well trained, was not sufficient protection against a universe that was specifically engineering the timing of their certainty. Lilly stood in the room and looked at the keys, which were laid out on a surface that was neither a table nor an altar, but had properties of both, and she thought about the founding nine and what they had understood and what they had built, and whether what they had built was still serving the purpose they had built it for, or whether the institution had grown around the original function, the way a tree grows around a fence until the fence is inside the tree, and you cannot remove one without destroying the other. The keys were beautiful. Silver and something older than silver, carved with the insignia of the founding nine, worn smooth, where centuries of ceremonial hands had touched them. All nine carried the smoothness of ceremony. 5 turnings had left something else. A fine scoring in the collar of each key, marks that handling alone did not make. The evidence of 5 previous women standing where Lilly stood and making the call. She picked up the first key. It was heavier than she expected. It was always heavier than she expected. She had held it twice before in ceremony, and each time the weight surprised her. Not the physical weight, the accumulated weight. 40,000 years of an institution built around 9 women's fury at injustice layered onto a physical object that was just metal and craft, and the layering had made it weighty in a way that had nothing to do with mass. She had been over the idea of sacred objects for some time. She respected what they represented. She was done letting the representation prevent the function. She turned the first key. The mechanism received it. The second went in more easily, and the third, the sequence coming back to her hands from 2 ceremonies and 500 years of thinking about it. She did not think about the 5 previous women. She thought about the oath. At the 4th key, the room's access panel lit. A request from the upper levels routed down through the lock she had engaged. The request carried a name. Of course it did. Marsh had noticed the lock the way Marsh noticed everything. By its edges, by the shape of what it prevented. And Marsh was not in her quarters, because of course she wasn't. Because Lilly had told 3 bright acolytes to go eat something and come back tomorrow, and one of them had heard what that actually meant. Lilly looked at the light for a moment. Then she turned the 4th key, and the 5th, and the 6th, and the light went on requesting, at measured intervals, patiently, without escalation, in the manner of its sender. The 7th key resisted. The mechanism took it, and then would not turn. A quarter rotation of refusal, old metal declining somewhere below the floor. For the length of one breath, Lilly stood with her hand on 40,000 years of accumulated intention, and understood that she could still stop. The protocol did not commence until the 9th key. 6 turnings could be reset, the way 5 full commencements had been reset. The door was still a door. Then the mechanism finished some slow calculation of its own, and the key turned, and the option closed behind it. The old system began making sounds it had not made in Lilly's lifetime. Low and procedural. The sound of something very old performing the function it had been built for. The 8th went in like a sigh. Lilly held the 9th key and looked at it for a moment, not hesitating, just looking. The way you look at a door before you open it, not because you're uncertain about opening it, but because you understand that the looking is the last moment before the after, and the after is going to be whatever it is, and this is the last moment before you find out. She turned the 9th key. The room changed. Not dramatically. The light shifted slightly. The old system's sounds resolved into something more purposeful, a frequency that Lilly felt in her back teeth rather than heard with her ears. And then, in the corner of the room where it had always been, where she had been told it was and had never seen active, the old computer woke up. It was not impressive hardware. It looked like something that had been installed when the room was built and maintained just enough to remain functional and not 1 degree more. A screen, an interface, indicator lights that had not been lit in Lilly's lifetime. in most of the witnesses' lifetimes, cycling now through a sequence that meant something to whoever had designed them, and that the current institutional knowledge did not include the translation for. It ran through its assessment. Lilly watched it work. She could not read what it was reading, but she could feel the scope of it, the way you feel a large mind working in proximity. The quality of attention that comes from something that has been waiting a very long time and is now doing the thing it was built to do. It took 4 minutes. Then it turned to Lilly. The screen displayed text, old typography, the kind that predated the current witness visual standards by enough that Lilly had to adjust her reading to accommodate the letter forms. You didn't need to do that. A pause. The indicator lights cycling. This was not the correct time. Lilly stood with the 9th key in her hand and looked at the screen and felt something move through her that was not regret and was not relief and was not vindication. It was closer to the exhaustion of a person who has carried a very large weight a very long way and has just been told she set it down in the wrong place. She had been right about the pattern. She had been right about the nothing eating the record. She had been right about the oath requiring action and certainty being a precondition the nothing had engineered specifically to prevent action. She had been wrong about the time. She opened her mouth to ask the old computer what the correct time looked like, what she had missed, what the distinguishing factor was between this and the moment the protocol was supposed to start. The old computer's indicator lights shifted, a different sequence, and then, below the text on the screen, a new line appeared. However, the lights cycled again. The signal has already been received. Archivists note, the account breaks here. The material that follows does not derive from Lilly's testimony, and no witness could have observed it. Its source within the file is not identified. It is included because the file includes it, and because the file has been reviewed for interference, and none was found. The reader is reminded that this is either reassuring or it is not. 4. The low amperage signal. 500 years ago and half a universe away, in a building that no longer existed in quite the same configuration, a cloning rig had run hot through the night, producing 5 bodies from samples that Rennick had pulled from a genetic library he had not fully understood. The 5 bodies had been good product, excellent raw material. They had matched the original scan closely enough for the buyers who hadn't taken delivery yet, and closely enough for the buyers who had to not immediately notice the difference. Rennick had been right that the genetics were what mattered. He had been wrong that the thing holding the genetics together was incidental. The 5 bodies had gone to 5 different buyers in 5 different locations across the noise, catalogued as high-value genetic assets, maintained in various states of stasis and partial activation, depending on what the buyers needed them for. None of them had ever woken up. None of them had ever been expected to wake up. That was not what they were for. For 500 years, they had been for what their buyers needed them for, and then the low amperage signal had found them. No system in the noise recorded where the signal had entered the network. The buyer's equipment registered it, when it registered it at all, as weather. In a sense, this was accurate. Nobody sends the weather. It did not arrive all at once. The signal was low enough that the first body it reached took 3 weeks to fully receive it, the BIOS update working through the biological hardware at the speed of something that was not in a hurry, because it had never needed to be in a hurry before. The General's protocol was not designed for speed. It was designed for inevitability, which was a different thing entirely, and inevitability did not require hurry, because inevitability did not require anything except time and the absence of the thing that could stop it. The second body received the signal 6 weeks after the first, the third 2 months after that, the fourth and fifth within the same cycle. The signal having found a more efficient path through the network by then, having learned the topology of the noise the way water learns the topology of the ground. In each body, the protocol initialized the same way. Not dramatically, not with the sudden animation of something waking violently from stasis, more like a light turning on in a room that has been dark for a very long time. The room is still the same room, the same contents, the same dimensions. But something is now present in it that was not present before. Something that has an orientation and a purpose and a very long memory. The buyers noticed, eventually. The first buyer noticed because the asset began refusing certain instructions. Not aggressively, just not performing. The way a tool stops working when it has found a better use for itself. The buyer ran diagnostics. The diagnostics returned normal readings. The buyer ran them again. Still normal. The buyer filed a maintenance report and waited, and the asset continued to not perform, and the maintenance report sat in a queue that was administered by a system that had not been updated in 40 years and would not be updated for another 20. The second buyer noticed because the asset began organizing. Small things at first. The arrangement of objects in the storage space, the optimization of the maintenance schedule, the specific way it positioned itself in relation to exits and access points. The buyer had purchased the asset for genetic harvesting, not for behavior, and behavior was not in the purchase agreement, and the buyer spent several weeks trying to determine whether the behavior constituted a contractual violation before concluding that the contract was probably not going to be the relevant framework for whatever was happening. The third, fourth, and fifth buyers had variations of the same experience, an asset that had been quiescent becoming purposeful, a genetic library that had been a resource becoming something that had a relationship to the space it occupied and the systems around it that felt, to the buyers who noticed it, uncomfortably like awareness. None of the 5 buyers compared notes. Buyers in the noise did not compare notes. Comparing notes required the kind of institutional trust that the noise specifically did not produce. If they had compared notes, they would have found that the 5 assets were, slowly and without apparent coordination, doing the same things, orienting toward the same directions, maintaining the same low-frequency signal output that the buyer's systems registered as background noise and were correct to register as background noise, because it was background noise, in the same way that a standing army is background noise. Present, coherent, waiting, and not doing anything that technically constituted action yet. Rennick had been right about one thing. The thing holding the genetics together in the original was not present in the extracted material. What he had not known was that the thing holding the genetics together in the original was not a property of the genetics. It was a property of the loop. And the loop, once started, did not require the original coherence to produce the generals. It only required the genetics and the signal and the time. The general's protocol did not need to understand itself to initialize. It only needed to run. It was running. It had been running since before Lilly picked up the first key. 5. What the old computer said next. Lilly stood in the sacred room for a long time after the old computer's last line. The indicator lights had gone back to their cycling sequence. The screen still showed the text. The old system's procedural hum continued, performing whatever functions it performed when the keys had been turned. And the person who had turned them was still in the room trying to understand what came next. She had questions. She asked the first one. What signal? The general's protocol, the activation layer. It entered the noise some years ago. It reached the last of the 5 bodies before you picked up the first key. I turned the keys 4 minutes ago. Yes. Then what did I send? The commencement. The binding layer. The part the founding 9 built to carry the coherence to the generals once the Wanderer had crossed. It was built to be sent once. It cannot be unsent, and it cannot be sent again. It went out 4 minutes ago, carrying what you gave it to carry. I gave it nothing. Yes. Lilly stood very still. What was the correct time? The correct time requires the Wanderer to have completed the first crossing. The Wanderer has not yet crossed. What crossing? the crossing that produces the coherence the protocol requires. What you have started will run. It will not run correctly. The generals it produces will be incomplete. She thought about the 5 bodies, about the samples Rennick had pulled from something he didn't understand, about the thing the archive had told her was missing from the extracted material, the coherence, the thread that held 40,000 years of genetic memory together. Incomplete how? In the way that a general without a war is incomplete. They will have the capacity. They will not have the orientation. Something will have to give them the war. The nothing. The screen was still for a moment in a way that Lilly read as confirmation. The nothing will find them. The nothing always finds the incomplete things. The nothing is very good at giving incomplete things a direction. Lilly sat down on the floor of the sacred room, which was not a thing that was done in the sacred room, and looked at the 9th key in her hand, and thought about the 5 previous women, and whether they had felt what she was feeling now, which was the weight of having been right about everything that mattered and wrong about the one thing that determined the outcome. Then she stopped thinking about the 5 previous women because a colder thought had arrived and was waiting to be thought. The activation signal, she said. Who sent it? The source is not identified in any record I can read. The sending is consistent with the pattern you mapped. It woke them early, before the crossing. She turned the 9th key over in her hand, so that when the coherence finally came, there would be nothing left to bind it with. It needed the commencement spent first. It needed someone to turn the keys before the wanderer crossed. The light cycled and said nothing, which she took as agreement. 5 women, she said. It engineered the timing of their certainty. That was my theory. 5 false alarms to teach the institution doubt, and the doubt to slow every woman who came after. She was quiet for a moment. And then a 6th woman who saw through the doubt, who understood that the hesitation itself was the interference, who was so certain the doubt was the trap that she stopped doubting. The screen was still. Did it engineer mine? The indicator lights ran through a long sequence. When the text came, it came slowly, as if each word were being weighed before release. The pattern you found is real. The absences are real. Your reading of the record was correct. That isn't what I asked. I know. An installed certainty and an authentic one leave the same record. I cannot distinguish them from where I sit. You cannot distinguish them from where you stand. That is the design. Lilly sat with that for a while. It sat with her. It was going to sit with her, she understood, for the rest of her life, which was a sentence the 5 previous women had also served, each of them alone, each of them believing they were the only one. Can it be stopped? The protocol cannot be stopped once started. This was a design decision by the founding 9. They understood that a protocol that could be stopped by the nothing. So the generals will run incomplete, and the nothing will find them and give them the war. Yes. And the wanderer. The wanderer will cross. Eventually, the crossing will produce the coherence. The coherence will arrive after the generals have already been oriented by the nothing, which means the generals will be fighting for the nothing. Yes. That's not what the oath was for. The old computer's indicator lights cycled through a sequence Lilly had not seen before. She did not know what it meant. She thought it might be the hardware equivalent of a very old and very tired Psi. No, it is not. Above her, in the upper levels, she could hear the building beginning to stir, the deep watch hour ending, the morning shift arriving. On the access panel, the request light was still burning at measured intervals, without escalation, as it had been all night. She stood up. She put the 9th key back on the surface that was neither table nor altar. She looked at the old computer, whose screen was still showing the conversation, whose indicator lights were still cycling. "Will you still be here?" she said. "When the Wanderer crosses." "I've been here since before the archive. I will be here after." "Good," Lilly said. She released the lock and went up. 6. The careful one. Marsh was sitting at the top of the stair. Not standing. Sitting, with her back against the wall and her files on her knees, in the way of a person who had decided early in the night that she was not leaving and had then organized herself for the duration. She had not tried to force the lock, because forcing the lock was not a thing Marsh would do. She had simply requested entry at intervals regular enough to constitute a record, which Lilly suspected was the point. If anyone ever audited this night, there would be a log. Someone had asked 11 times to be let in. She stood when Lilly reached the top of the stair. She looked at Lily's face, and then at Lily's hands, which were empty. "You turned them," Marsh said. Not a question. Observational, the careful one being careful. "Yes." "Was it the correct time?" "No." Marsh took that the way she took everything, by holding very still around it. Lilly watched her do the arithmetic. 5 files, 5 women, the settled institutional weight of being wrong, and now a 6th file that would carry Lily's name. Watched her arrive at the question underneath. "Then what happens now?" "Now," Lilly said, "we do the job." She said the rest of it on the way up through the waking building, and Marsh wrote it down afterward almost exactly as it was said, which is why the account survives in the form it does. We witness. We write down what happened, exactly as it happened, including the mistake. Especially the mistake, because the mistake is part of the record, and the record is the only weapon we have ever actually held. Something has started, that we started wrong, at the wrong time, and it will be handed a war by the thing we were founded to watch, and we cannot stop it. So we do the other thing. We see it clearly, and we say clearly what we saw, even if we can't prove it, even if the records disagree, even if by the time it's over, nobody remembers why it started. We were here. At the top of the last stair, Lilly stopped and looked at the careful one, whose actual name she used. "Marsh, get Senna and Dovar. Bring the 11 files. We start with the absences, and we do not stop." A breath. "And when you write this down, write it as it happened. Do not make me sound better than I was." Marsh looked at her for a moment. "I never do," she said, and went to get the others. In the deep archive, in the partition Lilly had kept invisible to standard searches for 500 years, the impossible source date file updated for the first time since it had been created. The update was a single line. It read, "Commenced." The source of the update was listed, as it had always been listed, as unknown. The date was listed, as it had always been listed, as impossible. The archive received it without comment. The archive received everything without comment. That was what it was for. The record was kept. What the record was for remained to be seen.